All right, let's dive right into the sources for this explainer and see exactly how the city of York acted as a massive hinge for Western civilization over the last 2 millennia. Most cities have a pretty standard life cycle. They're built, they grow, and maybe they slowly fade away. But York? York is a completely different animal. Its story is this epic, almost unbelievable cycle of creation, utter annihilation, and then miraculous rebirth. Seriously, if you stand on the city walls today, you're standing on top of a history of continuous destruction and incredible resilience. It's a city that has quite literally refused to die. Every single stone you touch has witnessed the absolute best and, well, the absolute worst of what humans are capable of. So we're going to see exactly how York shaped not just England, but the entire trajectory of the Western world. Now, to wrap our heads around 2,000 years of history, we'll be exploring 5 distinct eras. 1. Rome's frontier capital. 2. The Viking metropolis. 3. Norman wrath and medieval wealth. 4. Rebellions and civil war. And finally, 5. The modern rebirth. Let's get into it. Part 1. Rome's frontier capital. The foundation of Eboracum. We're starting way back in 71 AD. The Roman Ninth Legion had pushed deep into hostile British territory, chasing tribes who absolutely refused to submit to Roman rule. So they stopped right where the rivers Ouse and Foss meet and built a timber and eventually stone fortress. They called it Eboracum. And it's actually wild how fast York transformed from this rough frontier fort into the temporary capital of half of Roman Britain. By 211 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus actually dies right here on the edge of the empire. And his son, Caracalla, is physically standing in York when he decides to govern half of Roman Britain from this exact spot. Now, this rapid rise was all made possible by an initial force of 5,000 battle-hardened, veteran soldiers of the Ninth Legion. They didn't just pitch a few temporary tents, they made York their permanent home. They laid the foundations of a true city, building these massive bathhouses, sprawling barracks, temples, the whole shebang. And those bathhouses, that meant they weren't just passing through, they were putting down roots. But here is where we hit one of history's absolute greatest cold cases. Sometime in the early 1200s, these 5,000 men just vanished, completely disappeared from history. Their standards, their records, gone. Where on earth did they go? Historians literally still cannot solve this puzzle today. The Legion was simply replaced by the 6th Legion, who ended up staying for the next 3 centuries. So what's the big takeaway from the Roman era? Well, Western civilization quite literally pivoted on decisions made right here in York. In 306 AD, Emperor Constantius dies here, and his troops immediately proclaim his son, Constantine, the new emperor. Constantine then goes on to legalize Christianity, ending centuries of intense persecution and fundamentally reshaping global imperial power. That monumental, world-changing shift, it started right here. Okay, moving on to part 2, the Viking metropolis, from Eboracum to Jorvik. So after the Romans left, the Anglo-Saxons moved in and adapted the city. They turned it into this powerful Christian center where scholars like Alcuin really thrived. But in November 866, a terrifying new threat came out of the pre-dawn darkness, the great heathen army of Danish and Norwegian warriors. The Anglo-Saxon defenders really didn't stand a chance. But here's the thing, the Vikings didn't just raid and leave. They colonized the city, renaming it Jorvik. And notice the massive shift in purpose here. While Rome built Eboracum strictly for military control, the Vikings built Jorvik for commerce. They established these huge trade routes connecting York directly to Dublin, Scandinavia, and the whole wider Norse world. At its height, Viking Jorvik boasted a staggering population of 10,000 people. For the time, that is a massive metropolis. The streets were just humming with metal workers, jewelers, wood carvers, and leather workers. They were even minting their own coins under some pretty brutal leaders like King Eric Bloodaxe. Let's jump to part 3, Norman wrath and medieval wealth, ruin and riches. So, 1066, a year that changed English history forever, and York's fortunes violently shifted yet again. The Anglo-Saxons briefly reclaimed the city, crushing the Vikings at Stamford Bridge, but then they immediately lost England to a new invader down south, bringing some really harsh Norman rule to a fiercely defiant north. When William the Conqueror rode into York in 1068, he looked at a city that had defied Roman legions and Viking armies, and he issued this one dominant command: build me a castle. He wanted to make absolutely sure the city remembered exactly who ruled England now. But York being York, they rebelled anyway in 1069 and slaughtered the Norman garrison. William's response was terrifying. He unleashed what's known as the Harrying of the North, which was basically an apocalyptic campaign of systematic destruction. His soldiers turned Yorkshire into a literal wasteland. They burned villages, slaughtered livestock, and salted the earth so nothing would grow. Thousands upon thousands of people starved. The message was crystal clear: defy the crown and your world turns to ash. Now, as York slowly rebuilt its wealth, it also showed its capacity for terrible cruelty. This number, 150, is the estimated count of Jewish people who tragically died at Clifford's Tower in 1190. Driven by a wave of anti-Jewish violence sweeping across England just before the Third Crusade, a mob besieged the Jewish community. Facing certain massacre, many chose to take their own lives inside the wooden keep, while those who surrendered were murdered anyway. It is a deeply dark stain on the city's history. Moving into the 14th century, York had bounced back to become almost an independent city-state, and it got staggeringly rich from the European wool trade. King Edward I even moved his entire government there for 6 whole years just to fight the Scots. But then, the Black Death arrived. Despite its immense wealth, those cramped medieval streets were absolutely no match for the plague. Over a third of its population was wiped out in mere months. Workshops stood completely empty, and the economy just collapsed. That brings us to Part 4, Rebellions and Civil War, a City Divided. As the medieval world ended, and the incredible Gothic York Minster was finally finished after 250 years of construction, York found itself caught right in the crosshairs of vicious dynastic and religious warfare. The city was thrust into the Wars of the Roses, which was this bloody civil war between 2 branches of the royal family. York, naturally, was fiercely loyal to its champion, Richard III of the House of York, who they saw as the true protector of the North. But his reign ended abruptly in the mud of Bosworth Field in 1485, defeated by Henry Tudor. The White Rose fell, the Tudors took over, and they brought a whole new era of suffering to the North. The Tudors brought religious warfare that cut incredibly deep. After Henry VIII ruthlessly dissolved the monasteries, the Catholic community was forced totally underground. And this is perfectly exemplified by Margaret Clitheroe, a butcher's wife. She was arrested for hiding underground Catholic priests, but she refused to enter a plea because she wanted to protect her children from being tortured for testimony. As punishment, she was pressed to death under heavy stones. It's an incredible story of sacrifice, and today she is venerated as a saint. Finally, Part 5, The Modern Rebirth, From Ash to Heritage. After enduring centuries of military sieges, religious executions, and non-stop political warfare, York was just exhausted. Moving into the 18th and 19th centuries, it finally began to shift from a place of relentless survival to a place of fashionable preservation. And the real game changer that created the York we know today, that arrived in 1839. George Hudson, known as the Railway King, made York the main hub of his new empire. Suddenly, London wasn't this grueling 2-day journey anymore. It was a quick 5-hour trip. This completely transformed York from an isolated ancient stronghold into a bustling tourist destination. The middle class just poured in to experience the very history we've been uncovering. Yet, even as a peaceful tourist hub, York couldn't entirely escape violence. During World War II, its cultural heritage actually made it a target. In April 1942, Hitler ordered the Baedeker raids, which were literally named after a tourist guidebook specifically targeting Britain's most historic cities. Incendiary bombs rained down on the medieval streets, killing 92 people and destroying the 15th century Guildhall. But get this, as bombs fell on the Minster's roof, ordinary citizens bravely climbed up there right in the middle of the air raid to extinguish the flames with their bare hands, saving the magnificent cathedral. And believe it or not, the trials still weren't over. In 1984, the Minster caught fire yet again, this time from a massive lightning strike that engulfed the south transept roof. But just like they did after a religious zealot set it on fire in 1829, and just like they did after the Viking colonization and the Norman Wrath, the city simply repaired it. York's true legacy isn't the tragedies it has faced, it's this incredible, unyielding capacity to rebuild and adapt. Through every single disaster over 70 generations, York hasn't just survived, it has actively shaped Western civilization. It really makes you look at the ground beneath your own feet a little differently, doesn't it? So, which historic city and its layers of survival should we dive into for our next explainer? Let me know and keep learning.